In July of 1960, a young Englishwoman with no university degree stepped off a small boat onto the eastern shore of Lake Tanganyika, walked into the forest at a place called Gombe, and sat down to watch wild chimpanzees. The boat that carried her, the tent she slept in, and the airfare that had brought her across 2 continents were all paid for by a foundation in Des Plaines, Illinois. But that foundation's money did not come from oil or banking or any of the fortunes you might expect to bankroll a search for the origins of humanity. It came from a company in Minnesota that made saws for cutting steel. The young woman was Jane Goodall, and the most gifted tool-using chimpanzee she would ever document, she named Wilkie, after the man whose machines had paid her way into the trees. This is the story of how a saw built to cut metal ended up financing the hunt for the beginning of mankind, and of the industrialist who was certain, to his last day, that those 2 things were the very same story. You're watching Trade Archive, where we take apart the companies that built the physical world and put them back together piece by piece. If that is the kind of story you came here for, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It is the thing that keeps these deep dives coming. Leighton Allen Wilkie was born in 1900 in Winona, Minnesota, a town on the Mississippi River built by lumber and grain. His education in machinery did not begin in a classroom. It began in his father's garage. Julius Wilkie ran a machine works, and it was there that a small tool took shape for aligning the connecting rods inside an engine, a job that demanded a precision most ordinary shops could not hold. Young Leighton refined that tool, called it the Universal Wilkie, and went out and sold it. In doing so, he found the thing that would define the rest of his life. Not any single machine, but the gap. The space between what a shop needed to build and what its tools would actually allow it to build. Close that gap, and you could make a fortune. He studied at the University of Minnesota in the early 1920s, then moved to Minneapolis around 1926. By 1929, he had worked out a faster, cheaper method of stamping metal he called the Continental process. And in 1927, he had built the company that would carry everything that came after. He named it Continental Machine Specialties. At first, the company did what its name suggested. It built stamping machines and took on contract work, the unglamorous business of making the things that made other things. Wilkie was not yet famous. He was a Minnesota machinist with a knack for shaving time and cost out of a process, running a small shop through the teeth of the Great Depression. What he had that his competitors lacked was a simple refusal to accept that the slowest step in any job had to stay the slowest step. To understand what Wilkie did next, you have to understand the problem that was quietly strangling American manufacturing in the 1920s. If a factory wanted to stamp a part out of sheet steel, someone first had to build the die, a hardened steel block with the exact shape of the finished part cut into it. And the only way to cut that shape was a method the trade called drill and file. A toolmaker drilled a row of holes around the outline of the part, knocked out the slug in the center, and then sat down with a hand file and worked the rough opening down to size, by hand, by eye, for hours, sometimes for days. The die was the bottleneck of mass production, and the bottleneck was a man with a file. Every new product a company wanted to bring to market, every fender, every appliance housing, every cartridge, waited on that one slow man and his file. Speed up the die, and you sped up the entire economy standing behind it. Wilkie's answer arrived in 1933. Band saws themselves were nothing new. The sawmills had been running them through timber for decades. But a band saw that could cut thick tool steel was a different machine entirely. One that demanded a rigidity in the frame, a metallurgy in the blade, and a control of cutting speed that no wood saw had ever needed. Wilkie built it. His machine let a toolmaker drill a single hole in the steel plate, thread the saw blade through that hole, weld the blade back into a continuous loop, and then saw the shape out cleanly from the inside. What had taken a skilled man days now took minutes. And because the same machine could be fitted with a file band to finish the cut it had just made, Wilkie gave it a name that promised the whole job in one breath. He called it the DoALL. In time, the name of the machine became the name of the company. In 1935, the first DoALL band saw machine was demonstrated across North America, and the trade got its first look at the thing that would change the floor of every serious tool room in the country. But Wilkie was building this business inside a city that was tearing itself apart. In the summer of 1934, Minneapolis erupted. The truck drivers of Teamsters Local 574 had walked off the job, and the city's employers, organized into a powerful anti-union bloc called the Citizens Alliance, were determined to break them. For decades, the Alliance had kept Minneapolis an open shop town, a place where organized labor had no foothold at all. That summer, the streets filled with strikers, and with the police and the deputized businessmen sent to crush them. This was not a labor dispute in the ordinary sense. It was closer to open warfare over a single question, whether working men could organize at all in a city the owners intended to keep union-free. The fighting grew so severe that the governor of Minnesota, Floyd Olson, declared martial law and called in the National Guard. On the 20th of July, a day the labor movement would remember as Bloody Friday, police opened fire on a truck loaded with unarmed pickets. 67 people were wounded, many of them shot in the back. 2 strikers, John Bellore and Henry Ness, were killed. An official commission later concluded that the police had fired to kill. Ness's funeral drew tens of thousands of mourners into the streets. Wilkie left no record placing himself in those events. What he left behind instead was a body of belief. He grew into a committed champion of free enterprise, a man who would eventually write a book laying out his conviction that it was tools and capital, not labor alone, that created the wealth of nations. He had come of age in a city that nearly destroyed itself over precisely that question, and he had already chosen his side of it. The DoALL machine spread through American industry the way a genuinely better tool always spreads, quietly at first, and then all at once. In 1936, Wilkie's engineers eliminated the last awkward step in the process. Until then, threading and rejoining a blade had meant brazing the ends together by hand. Now the machine carried its own automatic resistance welder, built directly into the frame, so an operator could cut a blade, fuse the 2 ends into a seamless band, grind the joint smooth, and be cutting again in under a minute. Wilkie patented that welder in 1942. The saw itself, what the patent office called a sawing apparatus, was granted United States Patent 2,311,426 in February of 1943. Historians of technology came to count the contour band machine among the small handful of designs they call the basic machine tools, in the same company as the lathe, the drill, the mill, and the grinder. It did not merely speed up the old work. It changed what a toolmaker could even imagine building, because now a complicated internal shape was a matter of following a line with a saw instead of chasing that line for days with a file. There is a particular kind of invention that does not just improve a task, but quietly dissolves it, and the contour saw was one of them. The drill and file man did not get faster. He simply stopped being a bottleneck at all, freed for the work that actually needed a human hand and a human eye. Whole categories of tooling that had once been too slow and too costly to attempt became routine. Intricate dies, aircraft fittings, prototype shapes a designer could only have sketched a decade earlier, all of it now sat one careful cut away. Wilkie was not the only man chasing this prize. In West Allis, Wisconsin, the Graub brothers were filing their own metal-cutting bandsaw patents in the very same years, and the question of who truly got there first would simmer in the trade for a long time afterward. But it was Wilkie who turned the machine into an institution, because he understood something his rivals did not. The machine was only half the product. The other half was teaching the entire world how to use it. That instinct pulled Wilkie into a far stranger and more fundamental business than sawing. It pulled him into the question of what exactly an inch was. Mass production rests on a single fragile promise. A part made in one factory must fit a part made in another, hundreds of miles away, which means every factory has to agree, down to fractions no human eye can see, on the true length of an inch. The man who had first made that promise keepable was a Swede named Carl Edvard Johansson, who, as it happened, had spent part of his own youth in Minnesota. Around the turn of the century, Johansson created the gauge block. These were small rectangles of hardened steel, ground so flat and so true that when you slid two of them together, they clung to each other by molecular attraction alone, a trick machinists call ringing. Stack the right combination of blocks, and you held a known, certified length in your hand, accurate to a degree that bordered on the impossible. Machinists called them Joe blocks, and they were the closest thing the trade had to a physical definition of measurement itself. Johansson had spent years grinding his first sets by hand, and his obsession with flatness was so complete that he eventually went to work for Henry Ford, whose assembly lines could not have existed without parts that interchanged perfectly. The precision he reached is difficult to picture. A good gauge block is true to a fraction of the wavelength of light, which is why the men who inspected them did so under monochromatic lamps, reading the bands of interference thrown off by an optical flat laid across the surface. This was not measurement as a carpenter understands it. This was measurement as a physicist understands it, and most American shops in the 1930s had no idea how to do it. They were also expensive and tightly held. And as the world slid toward another war, there were nowhere near enough of them to equip the thousands of shops that would have to build aircraft and weapons to interchangeable standards. Wilkie saw the shortage, and he moved straight into it. Through a subsidiary he set up in Savage, Minnesota, called the Savage Tool Company. DoALL began mass-producing gauge blocks, and the precision surface grinders needed to finish them, ground to within millionths of an inch. When the United States entered the war, this quiet corner of the trade became a matter of national survival. A bomber, and the factory 1,000 miles away that built its landing gear, had to agree on their dimensions exactly, or the parts would never mate on the line. The country needed gauge blocks by the tens of thousands, and it needed shops that knew how to use them. Wilkie supplied both. DoALL did not invent the gauge block. What DoALL did was make the gauge block ordinary. It put certified precision within reach of the small shop, and then, true to Wilkie's instinct, it taught that shop how to use what it had bought. In 1952, the company published a thick volume called The Science of Precision Measurement, a corporate text that walked an entire generation of machinists through optical flats, monochromatic light, and the strange discipline of measuring the world in millionths. DoALL did not just mail the book and move on. It ran courses, sent its engineers onto shop floors, and built the habit of certified accuracy into the working culture of American manufacturing. A small shop in Ohio or Texas could now hold a tolerance that, a generation earlier, had belonged only to a national laboratory. The old gauge houses, firms like Brown and Sharp and Starrett, held the high end of the trade. DoALL took the floor of the whole industry and taught it to speak the language of accuracy. When the war came, demand for everything Wilkie made multiplied overnight. Aircraft builders needed to cut new lightweight alloys quickly, and DoALL answered with a friction sawing line it called the Zephyr, a machine that drove its blade fast enough to soften the metal by friction at the point of contact, slicing through alloys that would have torn the teeth off an ordinary blade in seconds. The Zephyr name still rides on DoALL friction saws today, machines that run their bands at speeds up to 15,000 feet per minute. By the end of the war, Wilkie no longer ran a saw company. He ran an empire of precision. There were the contour band saws, the vertical machines that working machinists would speak of with real affection for the rest of the century. There were the surface grinders and the gauge blocks that came out of Savage. There were saw blades, including, in 1957, the first welded-tip tungsten carbide and high-friction sawing blades the industry had ever seen. There were cutting fluids, because Wilkie had grasped that cutting was a system of three things working in concert: the machine, the blade, and the fluid that cooled the work and carried away the chip. There were even engine lathes, and here a word of clarification is owed, because that term has confused people for 100 years. An engine lathe is not an engine. It is a lathe, a machine for turning metal on a spindle, named for the long-gone age when lathes were first driven by steam engines through overhead line shafting. Wilkie's parent firm, Continental Machines, has nothing to do with Continental Motors, the celebrated maker of aircraft and tank engines. DoALL built the machines that built engines. It never built the engines themselves. What truly set Wilkie apart, though, was how he chose to sell all of it. Instead of shipping a machine out of a distant factory and wishing the customer luck, he built a network of more than 60 industrial supply centers spread across the country, each one a working showroom where the machines actually ran, and a trained sales engineer could walk a shop owner through a difficult cut in person. If a factory somewhere was struggling with a stubborn new metal, a DoALL man could be standing at the machine that same afternoon to solve it. It was a radical way to sell in its day. A machine tool was the most expensive thing in most shops, and buying one usually meant trusting a catalog and a salesman's word. Wilkie made his customers watch the steel get cut before they signed anything. He turned selling into teaching, the same instinct that ran through his textbooks and his exhibits, and it built a loyalty that outlasted him. Decades later, working machinists would still track down old DoALL verticals and rebuild them, trading notes on the welders and the gearboxes with the kind of reverence other men save for vintage cars. By the time Wilkie was finished, his organization had become the largest national distributor of machine tools in America, with branches reaching from Canada and Mexico to Australia, Britain, Germany, and Sweden. The enterprise he sat atop touched more than 70 companies. And this is where the story turns from industrial history into something almost no one would believe if the records themselves did not back it up. Wilkie held a thesis, and he held it with the force of a religious conviction. He believed that the thing which made a human being human was the tool. Not language, not society, but the capacity to make, own, and improve the instruments that multiply human effort. If that were true, he reasoned, then the private ownership of tools, capital itself, was not a passing political arrangement at all. It was written into the species, stamped into the bone. To Wilkie, the band saw humming on a modern shop floor, and the first sharpened flint clutched in an ancient hand were simply 2 points on one long, unbroken line. So he went looking for the beginning of that line, and he was willing to spend a fortune to find it. Through the Wilkie Brothers Foundation in Des Plaines, Illinois, he began funding the men and women digging into the question of human origins. He supported the anatomist Raymond Dart in South Africa. He supported Louis and Mary Leakey at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, whose excavations would help define the early tool-making humans, including the species Leakey would name Homo habilis, the handy man, the maker of tools. And in 1960, when an unknown and uncredentialed Jane Goodall needed money to go and live among wild chimpanzees, it was Leakey S. Grant from the Wilkie Brothers Foundation that put her on the boat to Gombe and kept her in the field for her first 6 months. Leakey was quietly assembling a group of women he trusted to study the great apes in the wild, researchers later nicknamed the Trimates, and Wilkie S. Foundation money helped underwrite the Primate Research Center that backed them. The same band saw a fortune that armed American factories was now paying for tents and field notebooks on the far side of the world. Then Goodall watched a chimpanzee do something that quietly demolished the foundation of Wilkie's entire argument. She saw the animal strip the leaves from a twig and push it down into a termite mound to fish out the insects clinging to it. A wild creature, making and using a tool. For 100 years, the line had seemed obvious. Man was the tool maker, and the tool maker was man. Goodall's twig erased it in a single afternoon. When Leakey received the news, his reply became famous in the field. "We must now redefine the word tool," he said, "or redefine man, or else accept that chimpanzees are human." The line Wilkie believed separated mankind from everything else had just been crossed by an ape. And the most skilled tool user Goodall recorded in that forest, she named Wilkie, after the sponsor who had made the work possible. Back in Illinois, Wilkie wrapped all of it into a single grand argument anyway. At the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, he mounted a traveling exhibit he called Civilization Through Tools, tracing human progress in a straight line from the flint hand axe to the modern bandsaw. At his Des Plaines headquarters, he built a hall of progress and filled it with the ancestry of his idea, including a full-size replica of John Wilkinson's 18th century boring machine and a genuine Boulton and Watt beam engine he had bought in England and shipped home, more than 20 tons of iron, across the Atlantic. The pairing was deliberate, and to a machinist, it was almost poetry. Wilkinson's boring machine was the tool that could finally cut a true cylinder, and without that true cylinder, James Watt's steam engine had leaked too badly to work. The machine tool had made the engine possible. The engine had made the industrial age possible. For Wilkie, that chain of cause and effect ran straight back through Goodall's chimpanzee to the first hand that ever chipped a stone, and straight forward to the bandsaw on his own factory floor. He even printed the whole argument in a booklet he handed out by the thousand, titled The Dawn of This Age. The scientists he funded were doing careful, honest, objective work. Wilkie took that work and bent it toward a conclusion they had never agreed to, that the fossil record was, in the end, a quiet argument for capitalism. The science was real. The sermon he built on top of it was entirely his own. There is something almost touching in the scale of his certainty. A man who had grown rich cutting steel looked at the deepest questions a person can ask, where we came from and what we are, and answered them in the only language he fully trusted, the language of tools and ownership. He was generous, and he was serious, and the discoveries his money made possible are still taught in universities today. He simply could not see that the evidence he had paid for refused to point where he wanted it to go. For decades, American machine tool builders like DoALL dominated the world. Heading into the 1980s, the United States still held roughly a fifth of the entire global machine tool market. And then, in the space of just a few years, that world fell out from under them. The blow came from Japan, where the government had spent years backing its machine tool makers as they perfected affordable computer numerical control, the technology that finally let a machine follow a written program instead of a man's hands. The Japanese machines were cheaper, faster, and computerized, and the American builders, grown comfortable on the strength of the manual machines that had helped win the war, were caught completely flat. United States machine tool sales collapsed from about $5 billion in 1981 to roughly $2 billion in 1983, and they never recovered the lost ground. Employment in the industry fell by a third in those same 2 years. Before the decade was out, more than 2/3 of America's machine tool firms had shut their doors for good. Storied names like Cincinnati Milacron and Brown and Sharp went into a decline they would not reverse. By the end of the 1980s, American production had dropped to less than half that of Japan and Germany. It was the kind of collapse that hollows out entire regions, and it carried away the heart of American heavy industry with it. These were never abstract market share figures to the men who lived them. They were tool and die makers in their 50s, holding skills that took 20 years to build, watching the only trade they had ever known vanish out from under them. The Midwest that DoALL had helped arm and build now learned the other meaning of the words Rust Belt. DoALL survived, but it did not survive as the company Wilkie had built. It pulled back hard from heavy machine tool manufacturing and reorganized itself around what it could still do well. It kept building bandsaws, blades, and cutting fluids in Minnesota, the work that had started it all, and it leaned into the one thing Wilkie had always been best at: distribution, eventually carving that business out as a separate company called DGI Supply in 2004. Today, that distributor moves hundreds of millions of dollars in tools across dozens of supply centers in North America, but most of those tools are now made by other hands. The manufacturing side never quite stopped inventing, even diminished. As far back as 1984, DoALL had built a microprocessor-controlled sawing system that could store and retrieve its own material, and it kept refining its saws and high-performance blades into the new century. But the center of gravity had shifted for good, from the factory to the warehouse, from making the machine to moving everyone else's. Leighton Wilkie did not live to watch the worst of it land. He died in 1993 at his home in Santa Barbara, California, at the age of 93, an inventor, an author, and a lifelong student of anthropology who had spent a fortune trying to prove that the urge to make tools was the engine of the entire human story. In 2004, he was elected to the Machine Tool Hall of Fame. Here, in the end, is what the whole arc amounts to. Wilkie built a machine that erased the oldest bottleneck in metalworking, and in doing so, he handed American industry the speed it needed to arm a war and build a century. The machines he made cut the dies that stamped a nation's cars and weapons, ground the surfaces of its engines, and measured the parts that had to fit. For a long stretch of the 20th century, it is hard to find a major American factory that did not, somewhere on its floor, owe a quiet debt to something Wilkie built. He took the very definition of the inch and put it within reach of every small shop in the country. And he went to his grave, certain that he had located the meaning of human existence inside a sharpened stone. He was wrong about the sermon. The chimpanzee fishing patiently for termites was living proof that tool-making belongs to no ideology at all. But he was never wrong about the power of the thing itself. The tool did remake the world. It simply refused to take his side while it did. That is the strange inheritance of the DoALL company. A saw company that went looking for the soul of mankind and found instead a chimpanzee that bore its founder's name. If you want more stories like this one, about the companies and the people who quietly shaped the physical world, subscribe to Trade Archive. We will see you in the next one.